Alright, this video is all about axles, specifically how to remove and replace axles on a Pioneer 1000. I've got some weird vibration going on in the rear end I'm trying to diagnose, so I'm upgrading to some Demon axles to see if it'll fix that. But I'm also going to try to answer a bunch of questions I've been getting lately about how to remove axles in general. I've got a stuck axle, how do you get it out, what's your method, what's the easiest. So I'm going to try to cram all that into one video. So yeah, this is everything about axle removal that I know in one video. So hopefully it's helpful. So like I just said, I'm going to show you how to change the axle on the Pioneer. This is a rear axle. Pretty similar procedure on the front, except in the front you have ball joints. So what I do is I just remove the lower control arm up front and remove the front shock, and then you can get the axle out. But all the same tips and tricks apply. I'm installing Demon HD axles here. If you'd like to order some, my promo code's on the screen right now. You can get 10% off your order of Demon HD axles or 5% off any other Demon product with my promo codes right there, MPuppy10 and MPuppy5. And what else was I going to tell you? Oh, so the first part of this video is just how to do the Pioneer 1000 rear axle, and then at the end I'll give you some generic tips and tricks. If you have a really stuck axle like on the back of a Rubicon or Pioneer 500 or any Polaris, they stick really bad. I'll tell you how I get those really stuck axles out. Spoiler alert, the Pioneer is super easy, but I don't have a Polaris to demonstrate on or anything else, so using the Pioneer as kind of a illustration of how to get other really bad axles out. This is a pretty similar suspension setup to most side-by-sides, you know, traditional dual A-arm, one shock on the bottom A-arm, etc. Pretty easy to get the axles out. So far what I've done is I removed the tire, I removed the wheel spacer, and now I'm going to unbolt the knuckle from the control arm. So it's just two bolts that go across here. They're 14 millimeter. I'm using the GoPro head strap to better illustrate what I do because it's hard to video with one hand. So take those nuts off, okay, and then take your screwdriver and you can kind of pry right here. Do the same thing on the bottom. All right, and pull those bolts out. So now the knuckle is loose. The order in which you do this isn't super critical. This is how I like to do it. So now I got the knuckle loose. Hopefully the camera's aimed properly. I can pull it away from the control arm a little bit. Those caps always fall off, that's fine. And I can turn it now, and now it makes it easy to remove the brakes. Otherwise my impact wouldn't have been able to get on here. You could have taken the brakes off with a wrench, but I am far too lazy to do that. So grab your knuckle. We're just going to take the caliper off. We're going to leave on the bracket and everything for now. Okay. We got our brakes out of the way. Tuck that up here. Little tiny rotors on this thing. Some mud in here. I'm going to go ahead and remove my brass brake pads. Need to inspect those. They're about wore out, but because they're brass, they'll last a good bit longer because they're brass all the way through. Get this crap out of here. All right, now we're to the point where we need to put some gloves on so don't bust our knuckles. I'm getting smart in my old age. So the simplest, easiest, and fastest way to remove the axle from the diff is just to use the axle itself and this knuckle assembly as a slide hammer. We're just gonna grab it and boop, 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 and pop the axle out of the diff. Now a couple things to caveat that with. Some aftermarket axles, you can't pull on the axle shaft because you'll just yank the shaft out of the inner cup. Almost all OEM axles, it's safe to do this. They have big snap rings in the cup and on the shaft to keep the axle from coming apart. But I think some Turner axles and maybe some like Gorillas and stuff like that, some double plunging axles, you're not really supposed to pull on the shaft. I usually do it anyway, and then if I pull the shaft out, I have other methods to just get the cup out. Because usually if you're going to do all this, it's because the axle's really stuck in there. Now, the Pioneer 1000 is very easy to change the axles because the axle splines themselves have gear oil on them because it has a real differential. A lot of side-by-sides don't have a diff in the back. They just have a ring and pinion, and it's basically a spool. And that means that the splines get a lot of mud and sand in them because the axle seal doesn't seal on the axle, it seals on the outside of the spool. So that's why Polaris are really bad. Polaris front and rear axle splines are usually pretty rusty and a real pain in the ass to get out. So the easiest way to get the axle out, like I said, is just grab this right here, pop, 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 boom. Axle comes out. So that's how you do a Pioneer axle. Dikes are the right tool to use for this because they bite into the cotter pin really well because it's soft metal. It helps you just get it out real easy. All right, and then that's a 30mm socket. We'll see if my little baby impact can bust this sucker loose. If not, we'll get the big one out. Well, that about killed the battery, but it got it off. Okay, then we can take this axle out of here. So this is my left axle, and here's the right axle. I'm gonna leave the nut on the right axle so I don't confuse them. Let's see the length difference. Oh wow, really big difference. So the right axle is a lot shorter than the left axle on the Pioneer 1000. And that's because the Pioneer 1000 doesn't have any rear universal joints. It's a straight shot into the sub transmission, so they end up putting the differential off center. And if you look at it, it's pretty obvious that it's off center this way. So your short axle goes on the right side. So the Demon axles are marked very nicely with unique part numbers. The 433 HD goes on the right side. This is the short one. But I always compare things just to do my due diligence. Yeah. Boom. Very, very accurate fit. So this Demon right here is for the right side, obviously. So that's going to go back in here. A couple tips. You don't need to grease these splines because they're going to go into gear oil, but you should put a little bit of grease on your axle seal. You should clean your axle seal and your shaft before inserting it. These splines right here should be nice and greasy. These pins that go through your knuckle, where'd the knuckle go? Those pins, those roll pins go in here, right? Those need to be nice and clean and greasy, and then you're ready to reassemble it. So I've already got that seal cleaned and greased up, and this is the new axle, so it's nice and clean. Let's go ahead and stab it. So I just kind of put it in there like this, kind of turn it, and pop it till it goes in, and make sure it's fully seated. Now, if you're doing this on a machine that like that Pioneer 500 or like a Rubicon, you got to put a lot of grease on the inner axle splines, but not so much grease that you can't get the axle to fully seat. So you want to make sure that snap ring is engaged and it doesn't come out super easy. Again, Pioneer is easy because there's gear oil on the splines. If there's not gear oil on the splines, it totally changes the game. Can-Ams have gear oil on the splines. The rear of the Hondas do not. Polaris never has gear oil on the splines. So that changes a lot of the methodology depending on what type of axle and what type of sealing setup you have. And like I was saying earlier, this is a really sweet differential because that seal actually seals onto the axle shaft, so it protects the splines. A lot of rear differential seals don't seal onto the axle shaft, they seal onto the spool or the outside of the splines the axle engages. So this is the preferred setup for waterproofing and keeping your splines in good shape. Okay, one other thing to point out, kind of unique to the Pioneer, Honda did a bunch of updates for 2022, and one of them was that they changed the axle part number. There aren't a lot of aftermarket axles out that fit the 2022 and newer Pioneer 1000, so like a 22, a 23, a 24. However, I use 2021 axles, and the only thing you have to do different is you have to use a 2021 axle nut, which Demon supplies. Put that tube on there, keeps it off your hands, and the splines are nice and greasy. Okay. Installing a 2021 axle like this in a 22 Pioneer, I don't put the axle washer back on because it makes it really hard to get the cotter pin in. It's fine like that, I haven't had a failure. But yeah, so now at this point, you just put everything back together the reverse order and make sure you grease the pins that are in here and grease the splines and you're good to go. Pretty easy. And when you're putting your wheel spacers back on, make sure to torque the wheel spacers in a star pattern multiple times and clean this surface of the wheel spacer and clean your hub. That way the wheel spacer has a nice mate and you won't have that come loose and have your wheel fly off. Okay, so that's it for the Pioneer 1000. The rest of this video is just giving you tips and tricks for getting a stuck axle out in general. Typically the ones that fight me are Polaris, like I've said a few times, but also the Pioneer 500 rear end, the Rubicon 500 rear end, axles can get stuck in those as well. I always recommend when you buy a new ATV to remove the axles and grease them if it's an ATV that doesn't have splines that run in gear oil. So yeah, that's one of those things that'll save you because mud and water will rust the splines and they will weld themselves to the differential. It's actually not differential in that case. It'll weld themselves to the rear carrier ring gear spool thing. A lot of people call rear ends differentials in general, but most ATVs don't even have rear differentials. I don't know if any ATVs do. Fun fact, the torque locker in this thing makes the axles really hard to get out. Last time I had to pull an axle out of there, I did end up using a slide hammer. You know, the outer cup was broken, so I welded a bolt to the end of the axle shaft itself and had to slide hammer it out of the diff, and it did destroy the snap ring. So the first one is the same thing I just showed you there, but while you're popping it, you know, you're grabbing the knuckle and using that as a slide hammer, use that inertia to get the impulse to pop the axle out. You have someone pry on it, or you have two people pry on it. So you put some pry bars on the back of the cup, pry against the frame, try not to pry against the diff. You'll booger that seal up or booger your diff up. And so you have some prying constant force this way, and then you pop it with the knuckle, and that'll help get it out. That's one way to do it. Another way involves a slide hammer. So if you have to do the slide hammer method, take your knuckle all the way off, and you'll end up with just an axle like this, right? And what I do is I put the nut on there, take my slide hammer, and I usually weld just an old bolt onto there, and then I can use the slide hammer to pull it out. If that doesn't work, have someone pry on it while you do the slide hammer technique. And then if that doesn't work, and you end up with a really stuck axle, you can disassemble the inner joint. So take the boot off, take out the snap rings, and then you'll have just this cup in the diff. I weld a couple bolts onto it, and I use the slide hammer to kind of rock the axle back and forth with a bolt here and a bolt here. Rock it back and forth to either get it out. Sometimes you end up destroying the snap ring, so you'll actually roll the snap ring off the end of the axle. But that almost always works. If you just take the whole axle apart and just have the cup, that slide hammer method will usually get the axle out. I'll show you a few clips trying to illustrate those processes I just talked about right now. You want to put this pry bar somewhere where you can pry and then you can tap at the same time. So you really want the pry bar on one side of your CV, and you want to be able to hammer the other side. So I'm going to see if I can do it for you to demonstrate without removing the skid plate. Boom, there it goes. So we just used a little bit of prying, a little bit of impulse, and our axle's out. Bolt in here that you can see has been welded to a lot of things. Those things are mostly Polaris's. So you screw your bolt in here, weld that onto the nut, and then you can hold tension here and slide hammer the axle. Sometimes you gotta hold tension, slide hammer while someone is prying. So that's option 4, I guess. I'm kind of losing count. So say you're doing all that and you end up ripping the shaft out of the inner cup. That happens on Polaris's. Then what you gotta do is you gotta cut the CV boot band off, get the boot out of the way, go in there, get as much grease out as you can so it's not a mess, and then I weld this nut right to the CV cup. The axle's destroyed at that point anyway, right? So you weld the nut to the CV cup and you just start slide hammering like crazy while you're turning the axle and someone's prying on it. So I've made devices that clamp on to the outside of the axle. In some applications that works okay, and then you can slide hammer to that clamp, use like an exhaust clamp. There are some axle pullers that can slide behind the axle and then you slide hammer from that, but all of that ends up having some wiggle. If you weld the bolt right to the cup, that's a really nice metal to metal contact, and on a really stuck axle, that's the only way to do it. Now, here's what you should not do. You should never hook a winch to this axle and try to winch it out. You should also never hook a machine with a chain to the axle and try to drive another machine, like take the Pioneer 500 and haul ass that way to snatch the axle out. Every time I see someone try to do that, they either break the differential or they bend the frame tabs where the diff goes. You want to use a small slide hammer with a lot of impulse directly onto the cup. So that is worst case scenario. I've had axles that were stuck so bad, I literally cut off the CV boot, went in there, there's a snap ring, removed the big snap ring so I could disassemble the axle. That way the outside half was saved. And then I welded a couple bolts to the CV cup and went around in a circle for like an hour, hammering to loosen it up while someone's prying. Now, of course, if you have one axle that's really stuck, the other side might not be stuck. And on most UTVs, you can actually put a shaft in from the other side. So if this axle's stuck and you can get the other axle out, pull that axle out, put a big punch through, and just hammer this sucker out with a punch. On a Polaris, you can't do that in the front, and a lot of times both axles are just as stuck, so you gotta kind of go back and forth and get one of them out and then hammer out the other one. Now, some differentials, rear differentials, have a cross pin going through. If you pull the axle out, you see a cross pin, you cannot hammer the other axle out, right? You need to be able to see the axle shaft with the splines around it in order to hammer it out. But yeah, those are some tips and tricks to get axles out of diffs.